Hello and welcome to lecture 10.1, where we will be talking about the cell cycle. So before we get to that though, we're actually going to do some kind of general overview of what genetic material is and what chromosome number is, including a particular term that you all should get very used to, something called ploidy. Really quick though, I think the end of lecture 9.2, I had said something about, this is all I was going to be covering in this lecture, 10.1. Well, I'm actually going to also cover a little bit of just the introduction to the phases of the cell cycle, so you're a little more comfortable with it, you know what to expect for the next series, lecture 10.2. Now, before we get to that, though, of course, let's go over lecture question 9.2, sequence the process of cellular respiration. So this is a little bit of a doozy, but I like this question a lot because what it makes you do is it doesn't give you everything explicitly, right? You have to know when FAD is reduced. You have to know when citric acid, the citric acid shows up in the sequence. You also have to know that ATP is kind of the final product of this whole thing, right? So I like this one a lot. It's not like explicitly stating like, put glycolysis and pyruvate oxidation and citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. It doesn't say put those in the correct order. It makes you identify the particular components of each step and put that in the right order. And I like that a lot in an exam question. So pay attention to this one. Are you going to see an exam question exactly like this? No, definitely not. But you might see something similar. Okay. So what was the answer? C. If you said C, you're correct. Nice. Okay. And if you didn't say C, what you're going to want to do is go back, check your organizer, pull up the content about sequencing the whole process of cellular respiration, and double check that you actually have these processes on your organizer. Then you can use that to try to answer the question if you're still unsure. All right. Now let's move on to the content for today. But first, let's kind of do a little bit of a throwback, all the way back to, lecture 2 maybe? So we talked about the cell theory way back when, and the cell theory states 3 things. Number 1, all living things are made of cells. Number 2, cells are the smallest unit of life. And number 3, that cells only come from other cells through some means of cell division. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, cell division is a kind of critical part of what we call the cell cycle, which we're going to go into more detail in just a minute. But in the meantime, so there are 3 reasons a eukaryotic cell divides. Now, unicellular eukaryotes reproduce through the process of cell division, while in multicellular organisms, it's actually how things grow and develop. For example, the notorious freshman 15 is a product of maybe too much cellular division around the stomach region, usually due to open access to the dining halls. Now, okay, that might be a little different in the current situation, but normally that's how it would work. Anyway, the last function here is tissue renewal. Simply put, if you have a cut on your skin, how do you think the skin grows back? Well, basically the skin cells that were damaged or destroyed when they were cut are actually replaced by dividing and making copies of the neighboring cells. In other words, the cell cycle. Of course, there's a lot of other steps in between that you'll probably learn about in other courses, but don't sweat that for GB. Ultimately, cells also reproduce their genetic material. That's kind of the most important aspect of this process, which we've talked about as kind of one of the major differences between living organisms and non-living things. So what is the genetic material exactly? Well, of course, we refer to when we say genetic material, we're referring to all the DNA in a cell or the genetic instructions as the genome of the cell or organism. In other words, all the genetic material in a cell, we call that the genome. Now, prokaryote cells only have a single circular DNA molecule, while eukaryotic cells actually have multiple strings of DNA. These strings of DNA are organized and packaged in a cell into what we call chromosomes. Now, in eukaryotes, chromosomes consist of chromatin, which is both the DNA molecules and the structural proteins that DNA molecules interact with, right? So here's your DNA molecule. And now once you start wrapping these DNA molecules around these structural proteins we call histones, now you're going to start creating chromatin. Okay. Now, during cellular division, to kind of make it easier to kind of move things around, we actually condense the DNA by winding it around these histone proteins. Almost like winding it around the thread of like a bobby, right? If you've ever, thread a string for knitting or whatever. And I guess not knitting, sewing. That's the word I'm looking for. So sewing thread around a bobby, it's kind of the same idea where the bobby is the histones and the thread is actually the DNA itself. Except for in this case, it's like a really, 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 really long thread of DNA wrapped around simultaneously thousands and thousands of bobbies. And they all kind of wind up together. Anyway, now nucleosomes are what you call the structures of DNA and histone proteins wound together. Or in other words, the kind of bobby with the thread wound around it. There we go, wound around it. Anyway, I need more coffee. Moving on. Chromosome number is how many chromosomes an individual has. Each species has a specific number of chromosomes that most of the individuals in the species have. Beyond that, from what I can tell, it kind of doesn't really ultimately mean that much. Like, how many chromosomes you have doesn't matter. What do I mean? So, for example, chromosomes don't necessarily mean more complexity to an organism or a larger organism. For example, humans are relatively large and are very complex, or at least from a developmental and neurological perspective, right? They have 46 chromosomes. On the other hand, elephants have 56 chromosomes, which kind of makes sense, maybe. They're a lot bigger and still fairly complex, behaviorally speaking. But what about something a lot smaller then? Well, this purple guy down here is a single-celled eukaryote from the genus Plasmodium. How small do you ask? Well, to give you an idea, those red things around it, those are red blood cells. Now, you've actually probably heard of this little organism before, even if you don't know it. Well, I should say that you've probably heard of what this organism causes. Any guesses? It causes malaria. So these single-celled eukaryotes have a measly 14 chromosomes. Kind of makes sense, right? Single cell is pretty darn small, so, not so many. Now, a quick note, if you don't already know, malaria is spread by mosquitoes that inject the paramecium into the bloodstream when they feed. Okay? Like this mosquito. So, what about the mosquitoes then? They should have, at least as many chromosomes as malaria, right? If we're going by the size equals, number of chromosomes. No, not so much. So, mosquitoes only have 6 chromosomes, so there's not really a pattern here. Mosquitoes are definitely bigger than malaria, but have fewer chromosomes. So it's important to keep in mind the number of chromosomes that an individual has, though. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. In the meantime, let's talk a little bit about structure.